A good place to start in understanding the Common Core State Standards is to see how they came about, to put them in context by looking at the history of the last 100 years in math education in this country. So, brief tour here, starting about 100 years ago in the early 1900s. What kids learned in math class was very traditional math with a heavy emphasis on arithmetic. And we did a lot of drilling with computation around addition, subtraction, multiplying, and dividing. And we called this accountant math because, quite frankly, this is what the workforce needed. We needed workers who were proficient at computation. And so there was no controversy in what we're teaching in our math classes. Everyone was quite happy with this traditional arithmetic approach to math education, and that just went along swimmingly until 1957. So think about what happened in 1957, which brought a screeching halt to this approach to math teaching. Yep, it was Sputnik. Sputnik, the Soviet satellite, and the key word there is Soviet. The space race has started, and the Soviets got their satellite into space first. So we had major changes in our approach to math and science education. So we're entering the 1960s, and there's really good news and not so good news about our approach to math education. The good news is the federal government poured tons of money into math education and science education. As a response to the Soviet satellite, we were going to create this elite class of scientists to help in the space race. So all that money went towards designing new curricula. And here's a bit of the bad news. The problem with the curricula we designed in the 60s was designed not by educators, not by teachers. It was designed by mathematicians, brilliant mathematicians who designed these very coherent and logical curricula. And we talk about these curricula as new math, mathematically sound. However, they had nothing to do with how kids learn mathematics, how kids think about math, kids' everyday lives. So these new math curricula in the 60s did lots and lots with set theory. So I was a kid in elementary school during this time, and in my first grade math class, we would do set theory. We worked on open sets, closed sets, base 8, okay, things that make sense for set theory, but to a 6-year-old had no relevance. And even more frustrating, parents were up in arms because not only could they not do their first grade child's homework, there was no application for this in their lives. In a reaction against this new math, we move into the 70s, and math instruction starts looking like it used to, that back to basics, traditional math, focus on computation, a lot of work in arithmetic and memorizing basic facts and memorizing algorithms. And everybody's happy because this is what it used to look like. In fact, it looked a lot like this. How many worksheets did you complete that focused on practicing computation? Problem after problem after problem of practicing, and then 2 word problems. Okay, so not a lot of math thinking here, just a lot of drill and kill. Everyone's happy. However, this approach to math teaching is now a disaster. It was the appropriate approach before Sputnik, but what's changed? Why is it not working here in the 70s? Because industry has changed, our world has changed, Even something as simple as a calculator is now introduced into our culture. Okay, so future employers of these K-12 students do not need someone who's really, really good at long dividing. Okay, they don't need someone who can just memorize facts. The world has changed with calculators, computers. Kids in schools will be entering a workforce that's going to look radically different. Think of the kids you're teaching now. What will their jobs be? They probably don't even exist yet. Okay, so industry needed future employees who could do things like problem solve, think mathematically, and not just memorize computations. So that brings us into the 80s, and the pendulum swings back again to what we call reform math. Now this is very different than new math. Okay, again, remember new math was looked a lot like mathematics. In the 80s and into the 90s, curricula was designed by math educators, and it was designed based on how kids think about math, how kids learn math. And that's fueled by industry saying we need future employees that can think mathematically, as well as what we know about how the brain works. We have so much new research starting in the 70s and going into the 80s, 90s about how the brain learns mathematics. So these new curricula reflected those new findings. During this time, the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics published an important document in 1989 called the Principles and Standards. And in this document, they described in broad general strokes what kids should be learning from pre-K through 12th grade. They also described ideas for curriculum and teaching so that our classrooms focused on kids creating their own understanding of math, personally meaningful solution methods, using different representations and manipulatives for real inquiry kinds of learning, helping teachers get a peek at what that might look like and these benchmarks for what kids might know. During the 90s, individual states took these general standards and then made lists of their own standards. And most, including New Jersey, took these standards and took the math topics and broke them down into tiny, tiny, tiny subtopics and ended up with these lengthy lists of standards. So that decade is really marked by this prolific generation of standards different by each state and including everything plus the kitchen sink. And as teachers, we were overwhelmed because each grade level had so many things to teach. And because there's so many, we could not spend a lot of time on each one. And it was this very superficial, what we call an mile wide and an inch deep approach to math teaching. Well, pendulum's going to shift again. Starting the 21st century, we saw a move back to basics, away from those reform math classrooms where kids were working on real problem solving and getting into this era of high stakes testing and accountability. The focus on accountability really added to the pressure put on each district and on each teacher, so there is a shift back to basics and memorization and just passing that test. Well, ironic that during this accountability era, we couldn't really look across states. We had no way of comparing how kids are doing because each state has these different standards. So there was a movement then to say, well, let's think about all states having the same standards. So these two organizations spearheaded an effort to look at the research on math education international comparisons, and then using math educators to write a set of standards that states could choose to adopt or not adopt. These new state standards, in a response to that mile wide, inch deep, look to be a lot more focused, fewer topics at each grade level, but deeper and meaningful, so it's not to be repeated in subsequent years. Also, to think about the coherence from K through 12, so teachers could step away from their individual grade level about a math topic and see what comes before that and where does that idea lead to in the upper grades. And then more rigor, and I'm pointing this out because until now there's been a kind of a dueling camps, one camp focusing on meaning and concepts and the other camp focusing on skill and fluency. The new state standards are calling for equal intensity in pursuing conceptual understanding and the procedural skill. And then also a deep application in real-world situations. The standards are, there's two types: the actual math that the kids are learning at each grade level, and you're familiar with the document in finding those, I'm sure. And then the focus on what does it look like to do math? What should kids be able to do, no matter if they're kindergartners or high school kids? There's these 8 math practices we want kids to do. And instilling these in kids is quite difficult. If this is new for you, or if this is an area that you feel insecure about, I like to recommend just thinking about the 4 most important ones. So we call these the non-negotiable practices, and that's having kids really make sense of the problem and to reason. And the biggie that I like is having them to be able to justify and convince, create these arguments, and then to be able to represent the world using math. Okay. Once we feel good as teachers in these 4 must-do practices, of course these other 4 practices are important, but I feel like that's step 2. Our work together in this course is going to be around this notion of coherence about the math state standards, because when we as teachers understand the learning trajectory for a child's thinking, when we understand where an idea begins in pre-kindergarten and develops over time, we understand where it's going in high school. We actually have roadmaps about how kids think, so teachers can understand the standards, how they hang together, and how best to help kids if we focus on the teaching and learning of mathematics.